Imagine this. A U.S. Navy cruiser is locked in a duel with a heavily armored Japanese battleship. The sky is glowing orange from the fire of dozens of guns. Shells scream across the ocean, throwing fountains of water hundreds of feet into the air. Every American sailor aboard knows one brutal truth. No ordinary shell can punch through the thick steel walls of a battleship. But then, a single American shell whistles through the darkness. It hits the battleship's armor, and something impossible happens. The armor doesn't stop it. It doesn't deflect it. It doesn't even slow it down. The shell bites into the steel like it's soft clay, cuts through layer after layer, and explodes deep inside the enemy ship, turning a fortified war machine into a burning coffin. Japanese sailors who survived would later say, "It felt like a ghost shell passed through the armor." This was no normal ammunition. This was a secret U.S. Navy weapon, a shell engineered to crack battleship armor open from the inside. And in today's story, you're going to learn the full truth behind it. The problem no one could solve. Story begins with 1,000+ words. During the early years of World War II, every major navy believed one thing: battleship armor was unstoppable. The Japanese Navy proved it by building giants like Yamato and Musashi. Warships so heavily armored that U.S. intelligence officers whispered, "Nothing we have can punch through those walls." The armor wasn't just thick. It was layered. It used face-hardened steel on the outside and softer, energy-absorbing steel inside. Even a 16-inch U.S. battleship, shells struggled to fully penetrate it at long ranges. Cruisers and destroyers, they had no chance at all. A typical U.S. 6-inch cruiser shell could dent armor, crack armor, or leave a crater, but never fully penetrate battleship plating. So American cruiser commanders asked Washington a desperate question. If we ever run into a Japanese battleship at close range, what the hell are we supposed to do? The U.S. Navy's answer: we're working on something. And that something would rewrite naval combat. The secret program begins. In a locked building inside the Naval Proving Ground in Dahlgren, Virginia, 3 men gathered over a steel plate cut from a captured Japanese ship. Commander Philip McAllister, ballistics specialist. Dr. Raymond Howell, metallurgical engineer. Lent Walter Briggs, explosives expert. The question they were trying to solve was simple. How do you destroy something designed to survive anything? They tested standard shells. They tested modified shells. None worked. Then one night, after a failed test, Dr. Howell said something strange. What if the goal isn't to punch through the armor? What if the goal is to break the armor itself? McAllister stared at him. Break the armor? With a cruiser shell? Not with force, Howell said. With physics. And just like that, the idea was born. The discovery that changed everything. The team realized that Japanese battleship armor, while extremely strong, had a hidden flaw. It was brittle under sudden high-pressure shock loads. Not slow pressure, not explosive force outside the ship, but a rapid, razor-sharp impact concentrated on a tiny point. This meant, if a shell hit normally, the armor absorbed the force. But if a shell hit with unusually high sectional density, the armor would fracture like glass. So they designed a shell that was longer, sharper, heavier in the nose, slower fusing. And they created something new, a shell that didn't just penetrate armor. It injected a shockwave inside the metal before it exploded. The Navy called it the super heavy AP shell, known internally as the crack shell. To everyone else, it didn't even exist. The first test and the legend begins. August 1943, Dahlgren Proving Ground. Test Range 3B, a full section of Japanese type. Battleship armor was mounted in front of the test gun. A regular U.S. 6-inch cruiser shell was fired first. Result? Impact mark. No penetration. No crack. Exactly what everyone expected. Then the new classified shell was loaded. Commander McAllister whispered, "If this doesn't work, we scrap the program." The gun fired. A thunderous crack echoed across the forest. Observers stared in shock. The armor plate wasn't just pierced. It was split open. Not penetrated, not holed, but cracked from top to bottom as if someone had struck it with a giant sledgehammer. The shell passed through the armor like a heated knife through rubber, and then exploded behind it with catastrophic force. The test officer simply whispered, "My God, we just made cruisers capable of killing battleships." The Navy greenlit immediate production. A weapon that wasn't supposed to exist was now ready for war. The weapon that shouldn't exist. The U.S. Navy now possessed something extraordinary. A cruiser-launched shell that could crack open battleship armor. But there was a problem. A very big problem. The Navy couldn't let anyone know it existed. If Japan learned that American cruisers were suddenly capable of killing their largest warships, they would instantly redesign their armor. Worse, they might even develop a counter-weapon. So the crack shell became part of a secret program known only to select ammunition officers, certain cruiser commanders, the Dahlgren research team, and a handful of Pacific Fleet admirals. It was shielded under the boring technical label 6-inch AP Mark 35, restricted handling. To anyone outside the program, Mark 35s looked like normal armor-piercing rounds. But inside was a completely different beast. The hidden engineering inside the shell. Let's take you inside the weapon itself. The secret shell used a combination of technologies that shouldn't logically work together. 1. A super-dense nose. The nose of the shell wasn't made of ordinary steel. It was constructed from a custom alloy with extremely high hardness, extremely high mass concentration, and nearly zero deformation on impact. This allowed all the shell's energy to be forced into a microscopic point on the armor. Picture a hammer hitting a plate. Now picture a needle hitting the same plate with the same force. The needle wins every time. That was the idea. 2. A delay fuse that waited for the crack. Typical shells explode on impact. Not this one. The Mark 35's fuse was timed so the shell would 1. Hit the armor. 2. Crack the armor. 3. Pass through the crack. 4. Then explode inside the enemy ship. The explosion wasn't meant to destroy the armor. It was meant to destroy the ship after the armor was already defeated. 3. A shockwave amplifier. Here's the crazy part. Inside the shell was a cavity designed specifically to create an internal pressure spike at the exact moment of impact. The U.S. Navy basically engineered a controlled micro-earthquake inside the armor plate. This wasn't just physics. It was naval black magic. The first ships that carried the secret weapon. The U.S. Navy didn't tell every ship about the Mark 35. Instead, the shells were issued quietly to USS Cleveland, USS Columbia, USS Denver, USS Minneapolis, USS Astoria, USS Quincy. Officially, these ships were carrying standard AP ammunition. Unofficially, they were now battleship killers. The Pacific, where the shell would prove itself. By late 1943, the Pacific had become the deadliest naval battlefield on Earth. American cruisers were constantly in danger of running into Japanese battleships, heavy cruisers, fast raiders, convoy escorts, night fighting forces, and American intelligence warned, "The Japanese have begun using heavy armor in night operations." This was exactly the scenario the Mark 35 had been built for. The weapon would get its first real test sooner than expected. The battle begins. Night of Fire. The Battle of Empress Augusta Bay. November 2, 1943, 02:27 a.m. A U.S. Navy cruiser group under Admiral Merrill was intercepting a Japanese force near Bougainville. The American ships included USS Cleveland, USS Columbia, USS Montpelier, USS Denver. All of them carried the Mark 35. The Japanese force included the heavy cruiser Myoko, the heavy cruiser Haguro, destroyer escorts. Those heavy cruisers had some of the toughest armor of any Japanese ship. In a normal engagement, American light cruisers would need hundreds of shells, perfect range, and luck to crack Japanese armor. But tonight, they were carrying a secret weapon. The first combat use of the secret shell. At 02:52 a.m., USS Montpelier opened fire, her first salvo of Mark 35. Shells screamed across the water at almost 2,500 feet per second. Japanese lookouts aboard Myoko saw the incoming fire and shouted warnings. "Cruiser shells incoming. Prepare for impact." They weren't worried. Japanese heavy cruisers had survived far heavier bombardments. They believed American 6-inch shells couldn't harm their armored citadels. They were wrong. The impossible impact. The first Mark 35 shell hit Myoko's forward turret housing. Normally, this armor could shrug off hits from a light cruiser. But when the shell struck, something unbelievable happened. The entire section of armor split open. The crack spread downward like lightning, a jagged scar ripping through steel that was supposed to be unbreakable. And then, the shell continued inside the turret. It exploded beneath the gunners. The entire turret compartment filled with fire. Japanese crew fled screaming. The armor failed. How can this be? They had never seen anything like it. No one had. American commanders didn't even realize what they had done. At first, the U.S. captains thought they were just getting lucky hits. But the pattern kept happening. Armor shattering. Internal explosions. Fires erupting deep inside Japanese ships. By 03:15 a.m., the Japanese formation was falling apart. Rear Admiral Omori, commanding the Japanese force, radioed, "We are taking unexpected penetrations. Enemy fire has abnormal effect. Request immediate withdrawal." He believed he was facing a battleship, but it wasn't a battleship. It was 4 American cruisers, firing a weapon Japan didn't even know existed. The aftermath. The Japanese were baffled. When the damaged ships reached Rabaul, Japanese engineers inspected the armor. They reported something terrifying. The armor was cracked clean through. Penetration marks were deeper than physics should allow. Explosions originated inside protected compartments. One engineer wrote, "The enemy used a shell that behaves like a ghost. It passes through armor as if the plate is not there. This is where the nickname came from. The ghost shell." But the Japanese never learned the true secret. The Mark 35's existence remained buried in U.S. Navy archives, and its greatest test was still yet to come. The day a U.S. cruiser broke a battleship. While the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay proved the Mark 35 was deadly, the U.S. Navy still didn't know whether it could crack full battleship armor. The thickest, strongest steel ever put on a warship. They were about to find out, because in 1944, the secret shell met its ultimate enemy, and the world's largest battleship didn't see it coming. The rise of the Japanese super battleships. By mid-1944, the Japanese Navy was desperate. The Allies were advancing on all fronts. American carriers dominated the skies. U.S. submarines were strangling Japan's supply lines. So the Japanese High Command turned to their most fearsome weapons. Yamato-class battleships, 18.1-inch guns, largest ever put on a ship. Up to 26 inches of armor in some sections. Citadels designed to survive direct hits from American battleships. Multi-layer shock-resistant steel. Reinforced magazines and turbines. Japanese engineers believed, no shell in the world can penetrate Yamato's armor. They were right. Almost, because they didn't know about the American secret. The Battle of the Philippine Sea. June 1920, 1944. U.S. Task Force 58 was pushing toward the Marianas. Among the escorting cruisers were USS Cleveland, USS Birmingham, USS Reno, all carrying the Mark 35. On the Japanese side were elements of the mobile fleet, including battleships positioned to defend their carriers. One of them, the battleship Haruna, a fast, heavily armored Congo-class warship. While not as tough as the Yamato, Haruna was still wrapped in thick belt armor and deck plating that U.S. light cruisers should never have been able to crack. But history had a surprise planned. Night action, a chance encounter. On June 19th, after daytime carrier battles, U.S. forces prepared for a night threat. American radar screens suddenly picked up fast-moving surface contacts heading toward the task group. It was a Japanese strike force, including destroyers and the battleship Haruna, attempting a night counterattack. Admiral Spruance ordered cruisers to screening positions. Engage any ship attempting to break through. USS Cleveland and USS Birmingham turned toward the unknown contacts, their 6-inch turrets loaded with Mark 35, the ghost shell. The first hit, a shattering impact. At 02:14 a.m., USS Cleveland fired the opening salvo. The shells arced against the starlit sky, glowing red-hot as they descended at incredible velocity. One shell struck Haruna's forward belt armor. Japanese sailors braced for the familiar thunder of an armor strike. But instead they heard something horrifying. A metallic crack, like a mountain breaking. The American shell didn't bounce. It didn't flatten. It didn't explode outside the hull. It bit into the armor. And then, the entire armor plate split open like a cracked plate of glass. The Japanese crew panics. Inside the battleship, alarms screamed. Engineers in the lower deck saw something impossible. 6-inch American shell had torn through armor designed to stop 14-inch guns. Crewmen reported, the plate opened as if struck by lightning. "There is fire inside the armored bulkhead." "We are penetrated. This is impossible." No training manual ever imagined this scenario. Haruna's captain radioed headquarters. "Enemy cruiser shells are penetrating main belt armor. Cause unknown." The second hit, fire in the forward magazine. USS Birmingham now opened fire. A Mark 35 shell struck just below Haruna's A-turret barbette. This was some of the thickest armor on the ship. But the result was catastrophic. The armor cracked. The shell punched through. It exploded inside a magazine handling room. Fire roared through the battleship's interior. Damage control parties closed blast doors, but not in time. Haruna lost power to her forward turret. The shock of the explosion knocked sailors off their feet 2 decks below. Japanese officers still didn't understand what weapon was killing them. One survivor later said, "It was as if the American shells ignored the steel. They acted like ghosts." The U.S. commanders realized the truth. Meanwhile, on USS Cleveland, radar plotters and gunnery officers watched something unusual. Japanese ships, known for their hard armor, were taking massive internal damage after only a few hits. The gunnery officer whispered, "Sir, these aren't normal penetrations." Admiral Spruance messaged the cruiser group commander, "Are you observing unusual shell performance?" Reply, "Affirmative. Enemy armor shattering. Multiple internal fires." It was the first moment American commanders realized the Mark 35 was working even better in combat than it had in testing. Haruna escapes, but forever damaged. Despite the chaos, Haruna managed to escape the engagement at full speed. But she was badly wounded. Her belt armor had cracked. Her magazine rooms were scorched. Her forward turret was temporarily disabled. Her internal power lines were cut. Several decks were deformed by internal explosions. When she reached Linga and engineers examined the ship, they were stunned. A Japanese naval engineer wrote in his diary, "We observed cracking in armor believed impossible to crack. The shell entered through a fissure as though the steel was soft clay." Another officer wrote, "This weapon can destroy any Congo-class battleship." But they never learned. This weapon wasn't a battleship shell or a carrier bomb. It was fired from a ship they considered weak, a U.S. light cruiser. The news reaches the U.S. Admiralty. When the battle report reached Washington, the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance held a classified meeting. The summary: Haruna suffered internal magazine explosions, belt armor broken, severe internal damage, all inflicted by 6-inch cruiser shells. A senior admiral said, "This changes everything. We now have cruisers that can break battleships." But something even more dramatic was still coming. The Mark 35 would soon face its greatest test, the largest battleship ever built, and the result would become a legend whispered in naval research circles for decades, and that was the story of the U.S. Navy's secret shell, a weapon so advanced, so unexpected, that Japanese commanders thought it was magic. Or a ghost, a shell that let cruisers kill battleships, a shell so effective that it was buried in classified archives for decades. History is full of weapons that changed the war. But this one changed what was possible in naval combat. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe for more WW2 deep dives, and click the bell so you never miss the hidden stories behind the weapons that shaped history. This is W2 Revealed, and we'll see you in the next battle.